Hello and welcome to Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online. My name is Kelly and I'm a former wedding planner and blogger, and I'm obsessed with weddings. If you're planning a wedding in Ireland, you're in the right place. You're going to learn the tried and tested methods to planning your dream wedding without the added stress. Think of this as your one-stop shop for everything to do with planning your wedding in Ireland, with me, your new wedding planning bestie, and a cup of tea. This is Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online. Hello and welcome to Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online. As you can tell by the title of this podcast episode, I'm going to give myself the opportunity to rant a little bit on behalf of wedding guests everywhere, because today we are talking about things that guests hate at weddings. Now, before we get started, if you haven't listened to last week's episode, it was all about how to plan your wedding day timeline. I had a special guest called Everita Kenny, and she helped us to walk through the wedding day timeline and how to allocate different amounts of time to different aspects of the wedding day so that you don't end up having a whole lot of time where you're doing nothing and then other chunks of time where you feel like you're rushing from one thing to the next. So if you haven't listened to that, you should check it out. It was a great episode, and Everita shared a lot of amazing practical tips on what you can do with your wedding morning timeline as well, thinking about hair and makeup and timings of all of that. So don't miss that episode. But back to things that guests hate about weddings. Now, of course, it's your wedding day. It's going to be an amazing day for you, your family, your friends. All your guests are going to have an amazing time. So before you worry, it's going to be awesome. So don't stress. But it's also not surprising that there are things that certain people don't like, and we're going to talk about those together. But I'm not just going to word vomit a whole list of things that guests hate about weddings. I'm also going to walk you through some things that you can do instead of those things, and some creative solutions that we can come up with together so that instead of your guests leaving your wedding saying, oh my gosh, that was so awkward, they'll leave saying, this was the best wedding I've ever been to because I felt like I was looked after and it was absolutely amazing. So if you want your guests to have a great time, which of course you do, we're going to pay attention to some things that they love and some things that they don't love. So I've got a little list here. I'm going to go through them together. So first thing that guests hate is tons and tons of rules. So now it's perfectly acceptable to have a couple of things and to put some rules in place. For example, if you're having an unplugged wedding ceremony and you don't want any phones or anyone taking pictures or any technology being present, that's totally acceptable and it's absolutely fine. And I think that guests are starting to become used to that. An unplugged ceremony is not unusual. It's not uncommon. In fact, there is a video doing the rounds on social media at the moment of a wedding where the officiant or the celebrant actually paused for a few minutes and said, okay, everyone, now's your chance to take photos of the couple. And it was just such an interesting take on the unplugged ceremony, because the rest of the ceremony, of course, guests had their phones put away and on airplane mode. But having a couple of rules is completely fine, but things get a little bit tricky when you have a number of different rules and a number of things that you are quite passionate about. And so my advice is, if you want to keep the fun and the spontaneity in your wedding, because those are the things that make weddings fun and enjoyable for everybody, think about the things that are priorities to you and focus on those. And then relax about everything else. So we used the unplugged ceremony as an example, or, for my wedding, I decided I wasn't going to wear a white wedding dress. I wore a light pink dress, and it wasn't actually a wedding dress. It was just a dress that I thought was really pretty, and it could have been a wedding dress. It just wasn't actually one. And I ended up seeing a photo on Instagram like 2 weeks before my wedding where somebody who was going to be at my wedding was wearing the exact dress that I had bought for my wedding day. And I was horrified, and I thought, oh my gosh, what if somebody buys this dress and wears it to my wedding? So what I decided to do was to implement the rule that people couldn't wear pink to the wedding. It also meant that my 9 bridesmaids in their different shades of pink could stand out in their pink dresses. I had my pink dress, and that was the one and only rule that I had that made me feel like I was a little bit on top of things and I wasn't going to have somebody arrive at my wedding day wearing the same dress as me. So for you, if you have something that you are picky about, or if there's something that you really want to implement as a rule, Stick with that, but then you have to be relaxed about everything else. So, next thing that guests hate. Now, hear me out. Midweek weddings. They don't hate the midweek weddings themselves. In fact, we are going to do an episode in a couple of weeks' time about midweek weddings because they're actually pretty awesome. And the thing that guests don't like about midweek weddings is when we treat them the same way that we treat a weekend wedding. So, for example, if you're getting married on a Saturday, it's perfectly acceptable to have your wedding begin at, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. But if you're getting married on a Wednesday, it's a lot more difficult to get your guests there and available if you're starting in the middle of the day. So, if you are going to have a midweek wedding, and if it is going to be in the middle of the day, perfectly fine, but make sure that you give guests loads of notice so that they can take time off work, they can organize childcare, they can arrange accommodation and transport and all the different things that they're going to need that are a little bit less straightforward during the middle of the week compared to a weekend. Okay, next thing is pricey accommodation. Okay, nobody wants to be forced to spend a ton of money on accommodation. And it's even more tricky if there isn't any public transport nearby. And so our advice is if you can give your guests as much information as you can, and you can give them different pricing options, or if there's a hotel that you're getting married at and there's a block of rooms and there's a discounted rate, or, if there are Airbnbs nearby and you know that there is good public transport, just let them know. What you don't want to happen is for it to be a couple of weeks before the wedding, and sure, you've been super organized and you have planned everything months out, but guests are a little bit less organized, and sometimes they wait till it's a couple of weeks before the wedding and they start investigating accommodation and transport and everything. The last thing you want is for everyone to start doing it at the last minute and they start asking you questions. So give your guests information, and that will help them so that they're not stuck with an expensive accommodation option, but you've said ahead of time, just so you know, the wedding venue is pretty far, and so we recommend accommodation. It just helps everybody, and then they can be organized just like you are. Okay, something else that guests hate, awkward parking situations. Okay, parking is kind of a boring thing to be talking about on a wedding podcast, but it is important because lots of your guests are going to be driving and parking. And if they don't know where they're parking, or if they get there and they realize it's actually a car park that's designed for 50 cars, but you've got 250 guests, it gets a little bit uncomfortable. So if people are required to park a little bit further away from the venue, which again, totally acceptable, just make sure they know that ahead of time, because that means that they'll wear the right shoes. It means that they will arrive with time to spare so that they can park and then walk. It means people will carpool so that there's less cars and less awkward parking involved. It really just helps to communicate. So communicate clearly, communicate early on, and then if you can, give a reminder closer to the time. So an email to all your guests, a message on your website, anything like that that can just jog their memories and make sure that they are prepared. Okay, here's one. No seating plan. Okay, I know that the first thing I said was that guests hate loads and loads of rules, but as annoying as it is to have lots of rules, it's equally annoying to have no rules at all. Guests do need a little bit of direction, and this is particularly true if you have more than, say, 100 people at your wedding. So I know just as much as the next person that putting together a seating plan can be a little bit awkward, and you can be something that you agonize over. You look at your table plan and you think, where should this individual person sit? Should they sit opposite this person or diagonally opposite or next to them? How's this going to work? If you don't want to be caught up in the details, what you could do is you could let your guests know which table they're sitting at and then allow them to choose the seat that they pick at that table. It's a little bit of a sort of meeting halfway between the two options. So instead of having a detailed seating plan that requires lots of effort from you, or instead of having no seating plan, which can be awkward for guests, give them a table plan and they can choose their seat from that table. Okay, here's one. I'm very passionate about this because I hate this as a wedding guest. Long gaps of time. In fact, we've actually got a podcast episode all about this. I attended a wedding where it was a lovely wedding and I had a lot of fun, but there were some chunks of time between things where I didn't know what to do. There was a lot of time where I was standing around in new heels, must I add, and my feet were sore. I didn't have anything to drink for a period of time. I didn't know where the drinks were. And I didn't know what to do because the couple had gone off for pictures and my husband was actually in the wedding party, and so I didn't have him with me, and I was just like, I don't know what to do. I feel so awkward. I considered sitting in the car and just passing the time by or having a nap or something. So if you don't want to have long gaps of time where your guests are kind of aimlessly wandering around, not sure what to do, there are lots of very simple, practical things you can do, and you can listen to the whole episode about that. I'll put a link to that episode in the notes so that you can listen to it in detail, but I will give you my 3 golden rules. First thing is make sure that your guests have somewhere to sit. Second thing, make sure that they have something to eat or drink. And then third thing, if time will allow it, make sure they have something to do. That way, if you have a chunk of time between your ceremony and your reception, if your guests are seated, maybe, they're sitting it doesn't have to be a seating plan. It can just be like a really casual thing with chairs around or bean bags or picnic blankets or something. It doesn't even have to be expensive drinks and food. It could be some nibbles or a glass of water or something like that. And if you can do some kind of entertainment, it could be lawn games or a musician playing in the background, or even have your guest book. If it's an interactive guest book, have that around so guests can take part in that. It just means you won't have lots of awkward gaps of time with nothing to do. Okay, here's one. Guests hate it when the weather is bad. And now hear me out. I don't think anybody expects you to control the weather. That's definitely not on the cards. It would be absolutely ridiculous to expect that as a couple you would have your eyes on the weather and you could control it, because we know you can't. And if you're getting married in Ireland, there's a pretty good chance it's going to rain at some point. So I think the thing that guests hate the most is less that the weather is bad, but it's more when couples don't change their plans with the weather in mind. So I always recommend the couples have a plan B. So if you're planning on getting married outside, say you want to have an amazing outdoor ceremony with beautiful views and you want to have the mountains in the background, just have a plan B. So find a venue that has the amazing outdoor experience that you want, but also an indoor option so that if it does look like it's going to rain, you can go inside and your guests will be looked after. But rainy weather is not the only weather that you should be thinking about. If it's really hot, make sure that your guests have some sunblock. Depending on where you're getting married, you may want to have insect repellent. And at the very least, make sure you've got some water. So bottled water as guests arrive, specifically for outdoor weddings. Or if you're going to be inside and you can have fans or the windows open or air conditioning, just make sure that you look after your guests. In that way, they will thank you for it. Okay, we're coming close to the end here, but I told you I was going to rant. Next thing that guests hate is not enough toilets. Okay, this is another boring thing. We've spoken about parking and how boring that is. Toilets are pretty boring as well. But the thing that you need to know is if you have 1 or 2 cubicles for hundreds of guests, it's just not going to be enough. And people will be in queues for a long time. The toilet paper is going to run out quicker. It's going to get messier in there quicker as well. So if you need to hire extra toilets, do it, because people will thank you for it. So I know, again, it's not a pretty thing and it's kind of a boring one, but on the day, people will notice if you don't have enough toilets for them. Okay, here's a fun one. People don't like single shaming. So I'm talking about things like when you toss the bouquet or the garter. You don't have to do those things. If it's not a tradition that you love, just don't do it. But if you are going to do it, there's a way to do it so that you're not putting the spotlight on your single guest. You can make it fun. Another thing is an awkward singles table. Nobody likes to be grouped together by something random like their singleness. Just seat them considerately and put them, seat your single guests with people that you think they would get along with, and don't just group them together because they're all single. It's just a little bit awkward and they don't like that. Okay, here's one. Guests don't like to be hangry. To be honest, I don't like to be hangry on a normal day, but at a wedding when I'm not in control of when and what I eat, I don't want to get hangry. So you don't have to have lots of fancy food. I'm not suggesting that you spend loads and loads of extra money on food. You just have to have enough. So it could be snacks, it could be a bread table, it could be Tayto sandwich packs, like it doesn't have to be fancy. You just have to have something so that guests are not hungry or hangry. So think about the different points in the day and when you might want to feed them and make sure there's enough. So having residence bar treats, that's always going to go down well. Your guests will love it, and it doesn't have to be expensive. Okay, just 2 more things for you that guests hate. Long speeches. Okay, don't agonize over this one. Just make sure that when you ask someone to do a speech, that you give them a specific amount of time, and then you, in your mind and in your plans, have a bit of a buffer. So, for example, if you tell somebody that they have 3 minutes to do a speech, it's probably going to be more like 5. So if you tell them 5 minutes, it's probably going to be more like 10. So just keep those numbers in mind. I went to a wedding recently, a different one, where the father of the bride spoke for more than 20 minutes, and people did not enjoy that. So just make sure that whoever is doing a speech at your wedding, that they know what the time limits are. They can keep things short and sweet, and you can keep the festivities moving. And another tip, which we also spoke about in last week's episode about the wedding day timeline, when it comes to speeches, what guests don't want to do is be welcomed into the reception venue, go straight into a chunk of speeches, and be sitting there feeling hungry and not knowing when the speeches will be over. So I always recommend that you begin with starters or a snack of some kind, and then you have 1 or 2 speeches, and then your mains, and then the rest of the speeches. So if you place your speeches strategically, it just means guests won't be waiting for them to be over. Another final thing, guests really don't like it when they're not thanked. And so it's not a thing about people being petty, it's just considering the fact that your guests are taking out time to celebrate with you, they are traveling far, they're buying gifts, many people buy new outfits as well, and of course they're going to have an amazing time and they're going to love being part of your wedding day, but it's always a good thing to thank your guests as well. So on the day, if you have some kind of a wedding favor, that's a great gesture to thank them for being there. During the speeches, traditionally, it would be the father of the bride, if he's doing a speech, would thank the guests for coming. But whoever's doing speeches, it can be anybody who can just say, "Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. We're so happy you're here." And then formally thanking them with a note after the wedding as well is a really great way to acknowledge that you loved having them there, and if they've given you a gift, to thank them in writing for that gift as well. You can do a handwritten note, you can type up an email, even sending a text informally if you know it's going to be a bit of a delay before the formal thank you is a good start. So next week's episode is going to be a really good one because we're talking all about spring and summer weddings compared to autumn and winter. So if you haven't set your date yet, or if it's not totally set in stone and you're a little bit flexible, it's going to be a good episode because we're going to talk about the differences between summer and spring weddings compared to autumn and winter. And I've got an expert who's given us all you need to know about different seasonal flowers and which ones you should pick for which season. So even if you have got your wedding date set and you want to know which flowers you should opt for, you want to make sure that you listen to that next week. Well, thank you for listening today. The Wedding Wednesdays with Weddings Online podcast is produced by me, Kelly, and mixed, mastered, and edited by Glenn Hartman. For more wedding planning tips, advice, checklists, and more, visit weddingsonline.ie.